Hello and welcome to the Classics Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. Today we'll be chatting about one of the all-time classics, Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. I'd like to firstly welcome Susannah Fullerton as our resident queen of the classics.
Hi.
Susannah has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 19 years. She's also patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and of the Australian Bronte Association, and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society of Australia. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels, and she lectures regularly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Welcome, Susannah. I'd also like to welcome Louise Owens, who is the author of the book lovers blog of choice, readmeblogsite.net, and Sarah Burns, president of the Bronte Society of Australia. And of course, we'd also like to welcome back our book club members watching our Hangout on air. And don't forget to put your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to get to them during the Hangout. And now to the book. Agnes Grey is the story of the almost 19-year-old Agnes who sets out into the world to make her way as a governess. She dreams of the impact she will make as a governess on her charges and becomes a living governess with the Bloomfield family at Wellwood House. Her dreams become a bit of a nightmare when she finds herself faced with the most horrendous children. After a time, Agnes is dismissed and finds a second post with the Murray family at Fullerton Lodge. And things start out much the same, however, she gradually begins to have more success. A new vicar, Edward Weston, arrives at the local church, and before long, he falls in love with him. After a tumultuous parting instigated by one of her jealous charges, he's eventually reunited with Weston, and things begin to get much happier for our Agnes Grey. Susannah, over to you.
Well, Anne Bronte sadly tends to be the other Bronte, the forgotten Bronte sister. People remember Charlotte and they remember Emily, and then they think, oh, there's a third one, the what's-her-name Bronte. And I think that's really sad because she's a wonderful novelist in her own right, and she deserves to be remembered as the other two sisters are remembered. She was born in 1820. She died tragically young in 1849, and she actually died in Scarborough, where, of course, she sets the ending of her novel Agnes Grey. She only wrote two novels. Agnes Grey was the first. The second, of course, was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Both of them are really quite revolutionary novels. She's tackling subjects that were fairly new in fiction. In Agnes Grey, it of course is the plight of the governess. This is really the first novel in English that looks at the position of the governess and what those poor women had to go through. Then, of course, in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, she looks at alcoholism and how terribly hard it was for a woman to live with a husband who's an alcoholic and to have to cope with verbal abuse, physical abuse, and of course abuse of her child. So Anne Bronte was revolutionary, she was brave, and she was remarkably modern as a writer. And I think Agnes Grey is a lovely, strong but gentle novel. It's a beautiful romance, and it's an amazing portrait of the plight of a governess. So let's look first at what Anne Bronte is doing with the governess question in the novel. She herself worked as a governess. She's writing from experience. Charlotte follows up a year or so later with her novel Jane Eyre, which depicts Jane as a governess working, of course, in the home of Mr. Rochester. But Anne came first, and I think her portrait of the terribly difficult lives these women led is a very powerful one. So how do you think this works as a reform novel, as a book that's about the plight of the governess?
You certainly see it from the point of view of the governess, don't you? I mean, when we see, for example, Jane Eyre, you see how other people perceive the governesses, but this is very much from the personal point of view of her, how hopeful and how proud she is of her job, and she wants it to be this wonderful success and sees it as this incredible vocation, impact on children, and yet she's treated so badly. And you can imagine they are treated so badly as more of a general rule than that. I think it's quite powerful.
Her descriptions are so clever and neat and apt. You can hear those children speaking, and you feel very involved in her world. You feel very emotionally attached. So I think that she wins favour with the reader, and you get carried along, and you really are absorbed in that story. And so you do feel how she is isolated and how what a terrible position it is for her to be a governess.
Well, she's writing from her point of view. She's engaging the reader all the time. And reader, I won't bore you with that or things like that. And then she actually admits at the end that she's relating her diaries to us. So it is a very personal story. And I'm sure it has to be autobiographical. The scenes with the birds in both Agnes Grey and the tenant, she must have seen some terrible things that those boys under her charge did. And it's a very personal story, I think, and it must, she would have had her eyes opened with all the things that were going on in the houses that she herself was a governess in.
And what comes through so strongly, I think, is the terribly in-between lonely position of the governesses. They were not servants, they were above the servants, and they couldn't dine with the servants and socialise with them, and often the servants didn't like the governesses. And yet they were not members of the family. And so, you know, they're not treated like one of the family, and of course they get very little support often from the parents of naughty children who think their little darlings are perfect and can't possibly have done those dreadful things. So it's a dreadfully lonely position for them, and I think Anne Bronte captures that very, very clearly. And one of the interesting statistics of the Victorian era was how many ex-governesses were locked up in lunatic asylums. These women literally went mad and were locked away because they were lonely, stressed, underpaid, no decent holidays, terrible working conditions. And there was a particularly high proportion of ex-governesses in insane asylums. So it was a very, very hard job.
Well, she even had to apply to leave early for her holidays, like 2 days early to go to try and get in time for her father's dying. And they didn't understand why she needed to bother with that because, you know, well, he's going to die anyway.
Yes. There's just no understanding, is there?
No.
Do you think this novel might have been effective in bringing about reform in the way that governesses were treated? Do you think wealthy people who employed governesses would have read this book and vowed to do better?
I'm sure they would have thought, my children are not like that. I don't treat my governess like that. Regardless of their behaviour, I'm sure it would have been a reflection on others and not their own behaviour.
I don't think it would have been a reform novel at all. I think it might have been interesting, and they might have wondered where she got her information from, but it wouldn't have changed what they actually did themselves.
Yes. Now, what about the love affair in this novel? This very gentle love affair between Agnes and Mr. Weston. I mean, we're not swept away, are we, as we are in Jane Eyre, with the passion between Jane and Rochester?
No.
But go ahead, Louise.
I think it's a really restrained romance. I certainly didn't pick the ending, and I sometimes look for the ending. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was the restraint in it was worked really well with the rest of the whole story. That, you know, that she was this isolated person, surrounded by people in a position of privilege, and I think that worked beautifully. The romance wasn't right in your face, but it was kind of underlying, and it was a thread throughout the whole book. I thought it was beautifully managed.
I think the mutual respect. Sorry, Petita.
No.
Look at that Rosalie and Sir Thomas's marriage, which is obviously not one of respect. But you've got these two people who are quiet and sedate, and they both obviously respect and love each other. And that will be and she even says at the end, you know, we've had our trials, but we meet them together.
Yeah, I think what you said, Susannah, rings so true. You expect this Bronte-esque, chaotic love. You know, the hounds of hell, you know, from Wuthering Heights.
That's the other Brontes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually so much more impactful because it's almost so real. You know, you can actually imagine this happening. So it's quite beautiful.
Yeah.
It's very moving. I think that scene on the beach where, they walk towards each other and she sees the little dog, and I think it's a very moving ending to the romance. And you don't always need the tearing of hair and the passion and the sort of excess, and it's rather nice to have that restraint, I think.
And he's met all her any arguments that she might put up. He's already dealt with it. He's already spoken to her mother.
Yes.
He knows what she thinks and what she'd be worried about.
Do you think this novel is also a coming-of-age book? The heroine is a teenager when we meet her, and she wants to do something to help the family finances, and she wants to go out into the world. And she's led a very sheltered childhood. And her mother says, "Oh, just play with your kitten, dear." Yeah. But teenagers want to break away. They want change. They want to go out into the world and test themselves. So I think in many ways this is a novel about her maturing and growing up.
Well, it was her idea, wasn't it? She said, "I want to be a governess," and her family are just shocked because how could you be a governess? You hardly got any education yourself. And even when she gets that first knockback, she says, "I'm going to do it again." They can't all be like that.
It is very brave of her, isn't it, to go back for a second lot?
Absolutely. So I think it is. She's growing up through the stories, and
yeah, I think she develops. She becomes stronger and more determined, and I love that kind of really strong path that she creates for herself. She conquers those problems and those fears.
Yeah. Is she older than a 19-year-old today? Some, maybe. Do you like her as a character, Letitia?
I had such a respect for her courage and tenacity, and in situations that I don't, when you think, gosh, what would I have done if that happened to me? I think I would have just run home after those two horrors in the first job and not wanted to leave, a bit like what Emily Bronte did in real life. I really admired her for that, and I loved her hope. I loved the hope that she had, and I thought that was just a beautiful characteristic, and just writes these characters of fortitude so well, and yet they're so humble, and I've just always loved that.
I think she starts out with a lot of naivety, and she grows up, and the first experience knocked her, but not enough to put her off, and she went back out there again. I've just listened to it with Amelia Fox, and the joy and the youth was lovely, but she's strong, but it was beautifully read, so I really recommend listening to Amelia Fox's version.
The audio version read by Amelia Fox.
Yeah. And the positivity in it, a lot of these sort of a negative and dark patches in books, but she's constantly positive, Agnes. She has her bad days, but she's she's got a positive attitude, which is wonderful.
She's very focused.
Yeah. She's very, yes, yeah. I feel at times she's perhaps a little bit too restrained for me. I like my heroines to maybe burst out a bit more and show more emotion, but you can understand from her position that she can't react. I mean, if she tells those children they're little monsters, she'll just get the sack from her job. So she can't whack them. She can't, scream and shout at her employers because she knows instantly she'll be out of a job.
Well, in some ways she's very modern, isn't she? Because she's so career-focused.
Yes, she is, yeah. And that's unusual, isn't it, in the Victorian novel, for a woman to be career-focused. Yeah. So, no, she's an interesting heroine, and I like her, but I don't know that I love her. Do you love Agnes?
No. I love Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
They're very different. They're very different.
Jane Eyre sweeps you along with her, I think, more than Agnes does. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, there's no passion in this novel.
No, it's very restrained passion, isn't it?
Yeah, there's different kind of passion from different people, and with Jane Eyre and with Agnes Grey, they both have some pretty awful little kids that they've dealt with, and you kind of wonder, was that a discussion that they had at home, or did they know some little boys that were like that? So the passion seems to come from other people in probably in negative ways.
Yes. Now, another thing I think we ought to note is that this is a deeply religious novel, and Anne Bronte was considered to be the most religious of the Bronte sisters, the most conventionally religious. She, of course, was only a tiny baby when her mother died, and she fell much more under the sway of Aunt Branwell, who was very much of the hellfire and damnation brand of religion. So Anne, I think, got much more of a dose of that than the other children did, and is considered to be the most religious of the three sisters. Now, religion plays a big part in this novel. The hero is a clergyman. We get those wonderful descriptions of the horrible Mr. Hatfield, who takes off his lavender gloves to show the rings on his fingers, so we know just what sort of clergyman he is. And, charity work for the poor and religious belief helps to see Agnes through a lot of her problems. So how did you all react to this aspect of the novel? Does this, do you think, put a modern reader off? Would a modern reader find it maybe too religious? What do you think of the religious discussions in the novel?
I'm not sure it put me off, but I couldn't relate to it. And I think, if I was going through horrible moments, I'd run to my friends or my family, or as opposed to running to the church or running to God. So it was very hard for me to relate to those reactions, I guess, that she had at times.
Yeah, they were pretty extreme, I thought.
Yeah.
But I think
they might put people. Sorry.
With Nancy, who asks Agnes to read passages she knows herself very well, but she just wants that emphasis or that reinforcement of somebody else reading them. But she starts quoting the passages herself. So I found that interesting, but I didn't really understand that.
And perhaps for somebody as poor as she is, with all the problems she has, religion is what gives some meaning to her life.
Yeah.
And of course, she is failed by Mr. Hatfield, the clergyman.
Yeah.
He tells her to, ignore her rheumatism and hobble to church and she'll be fine, and has no understanding of the difficulties in her life.
No, or care.
No, couldn't care less. No.
And it's interesting how she is critical of, I guess, the earthly representatives of religion and compared to religion itself. So she still has an ability to critique it, which is interesting. I'm sure in her own everyday life she saw many curates coming and going from her father's home who had lavender gloves with rings on them. But,
it's a lovely touch, isn't it, the lavender gloves? Yes. But do you think for a young, maybe a teenage reader of today, it might be a bit much?
I think so.
Might go over their head, and especially the differences between the Anglican, talking about the Methodist, you can't, the reason you're not wanting to go to church is because you've got Methodist tendencies, that's ridiculous. We don't understand that now. But that's some sort of discrimination or class problem and religion problems that we don't necessarily have nowadays. Yeah.
Perhaps date the book slightly.
Yeah.
Some of that, yes. Yeah. And what about the two different families that Agnes works for? Now, we get quite a contrast between the two families, and obviously one she's with for a shorter time, and the other family for quite a long time. How do you think it works in the novel, having that contrast? Would it have been a better novel with just one family, or do you think it really adds to the theme of the governess by having the two different employers in the novel?
I think it makes it.
Sorry, Sarah?
No, you go ahead.
Oh, I think it was a really good contrast. I think it shows a lot of things. First of all, the first family, the Bloomfields, the children are younger. The Murrays, they're older. I think it also shows Agnes's perseverance. I can't believe that after that first awful family, they came back for the next one. I think it also shows, once again, that position of privilege and the older son, or the older, maybe the oldest daughter, and exactly what their outlook on life was, it's pretty alarming. You know, they thought they could get away with anything. There's a terrible scene with Tom Bloomfield and the first family torturing birds, and Agnes saying that is not on. And so I think it was really important to have those two families.
And isn't the first one engaged through a friend? Her mother has gone out to try and find appropriate connections. And then the second one, she makes a point of, she advertised, or she answered an advertisement, and she makes a point of saying, it's in a town, I don't know anybody, I've never been here, it's further away. It was 70 miles, I think, the furthest she'd ever been. She didn't know them, they didn't know her. Clean slate. The first one, I think she was a bit naive. She went in, and didn't she get dismissed because she actually hadn't achieved very much with the children? I mean, she was limited by what she could do, and then they said she didn't do enough. So, you know, catch-22. But she went into the second one, I think, with a little bit of experience, and it shows her growth. Still a bit of a shock. But then Rosalie's the one who keeps in contact with her.
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, in some ways, Rosalie comes to depend on Agnes, doesn't she? As a sort of confidant and companion.
Yeah. And then
we haven't discussed Rosalie. Do you think she's a pretty troubled young woman?
Oh, yes. There's a scene right at the end when she writes to Agnes, and she's just had a daughter, but she refers to it as it. You know, and her husband's disappointed that it's not a boy, and you can come here and look after it. So, and going on a honeymoon and seeing all these pretty things and buying all these lovely things, but you'll have to come and appreciate them because I know they're pretty, but I don't understand them. So she wants the status and all the trimmings, but not doesn't want the knowledge or care about that side of it.
Interesting character because she shows she's a product of her upbringing. You know, you see that in her mother and you see that in her family, and she was probably an it at some point. And
it's quite true. Yes.
So she's quite an interesting development in showing how, you know, that boy who tortures the birds is going to probably turn into that adult, and in much the same way that she was that child and turned into who she did. So I just think she's a really interesting character.
I think Anne Bronte was very interested in the education of children and how much was nature and how much was nurture. And when you look at The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and the way in which Mr. Huntingdon tries to corrupt his young son, and Helen decides she's got to take her boy away, and people in the village where she goes to say to her, oh, you've got to make a man of him, you've got to toughen him up, he's too much of a sissy. And she says, no, I don't want him killing birds and hitting animals and doing all those things that are supposed to make him into a man. So Anne Bronte, I think, was the one of the sisters who was most interested in those ideas of education and particularly what a boy needed. I think everyone was agreed that a girl needed to be gently reared and protected and domestic. But she had very different views about boys, and of course she had lived at home with her brother Branwell, getting drunk and, you know, called home from the pub, Blotto, every night. And so I think that too added to her views on how boys ought to be brought up. And Branwell had every opportunity. He was given far more opportunities than his sisters were, and look how he ended up.
Tragic.
Well, I think we can all agree that Anne is definitely not just another Bronte sister. She's certainly as talented as Charlotte and Emily. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the Classics Book Club today. Thank you, Susannah, Louise, and Sarah.
Thank you.
Next book club will be on the 19th of May, where we'll be reading The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. So grab yourself a copy and join us. We really look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.